for you valiant soldiers, a story I will tell about the bloody battle that was fought on Shiloh's hill. It was an awful struggle.
Evening.
Good evening.
Kind of snuck up on me there. I reckon the first thing that you ought to know is that it was politics that drove me to this grave. And I presume some of you are wondering, who in the world is John Bell? Well, for one thing, I ran for president against Abraham Lincoln. And had I been elected president, there would have been no war. And speaking of war, I served as the Secretary of War under two presidents, President Harrison and President Polk. Like some of you, I trace my family's heritage back to the state of North Carolina. My grandfather settled in these parts about 1783. He fathered 19 children. I was born 1797 and grew up out off old Nolensville Pike in the Mill Creek area on my father's farm. And as a boy, unlike most of my friends, I really never cared all that much for hunting and fishing like they did. No, sir. I always preferred reading and just thinking. I went on and attended Cumberland College in Nashville and graduated. It was the time that the War of 1812 was winding down, and this country was so full of itself for having stood up to the British the way they did. In fact, the South was just replete with a sense of nationalism. I wasn't much older than the country was at that point. Just a couple of years after college, I decided to make a run for the state senate. Perhaps I should have run from it, because it turned out to be the beginning of what turned out also to be a very long and sometimes difficult career in politics for me. State capital in those days was over in Knoxville. There wasn't any West Tennessee. There wasn't any Memphis. In fact, from here west was nothing but Indians. This was the far west. This was the frontier. I believed that we needed to have good colleges, and I also thought that the states ought to fund them. So concerns that I had over these funding issues prompted me later on in 1826 to make a run for the United States Congress. I defeated a gentleman by the name of Felix Grundy. Mr. Grundy is buried just right across the road over there. I believe it was the vote of Nashville's white aristocracy and the free blacks in the area that got me elected. It's a good chance that some of you are unaware of the fact that fully 25% of all the blacks in this part of the country in those days were free. And you know they sent a band over to serenade me after the election? I really enjoyed that. That was wonderful. In Congress, I believed that we should operate with a balanced budget. I thought we should take care of debts and obligations first, and then any funds that were left over should go to roads and schools. But those decisions should not be made by the Congress. Those funds should go back to the states where they came from to begin with. In a speech I made before Congress in 1829, I addressed these issues on the Cumberland Road Bill. When I advised them at that point, the United States Constitution did not provide for Congress to build a system of roads. Well, one of the gentlemen popped up and said, well, what if a state gives the right-of-way? I said, no, sir. The dangers look very obvious to me. First of all, a state cannot add to the power of the general government. The states would begin to look to the general government as the dispenser of funds. The general government would become everything, and the states, they'd become nothing. Well, by 1832, it was getting pretty obvious that we had a very hungry general government on our hands. There wasn't any income tax. That was going to be the doing of Abraham Lincoln and his Yankee cohorts later on down the road. It was tariff income at that point was about all that would satisfy this voracious appetite. You see, in those days, The Northeast, especially the manufacturers in the northeastern United States, were extremely jealous of the South and her successful trade with Europe. And with these tariff laws created many problems. Well, South Carolina negated the tariff laws and forced the hand of President Andy Jackson. He had to threaten South Carolina. And a slightly lower compromise point was reached on those tariffs and sort of settled things down for the time being. But frankly, had it not been for calmer heads like John Calhoun and Henry Clay, South Carolina would have seceded from the Union in 1832. Well, nearly 3 decades later, these constitutional issues had still not been resolved. And that's when I made a decision to make a run for the presidency. I did so under the banner of a new party called the Constitution Union Party. I carried 3 states: Tennessee, Kentucky, Virginia. Mr. Breckinridge, well, he carried the rest of the South, and of course Mr. Lincoln carried the North. Were you aware of the fact that Abraham Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot here in the South? I fully believe that a sectional candidacy such as his would only lead to secession. And I firmly believe to this day that Abraham Lincoln was chosen as President of the United States with a callous disregard for the ultimate consequences. While Lincoln himself had said when he was a congressman in a speech before Congress in, I believe it was 1847, any people have a right at any time to rise up and throw off the current government and establish one that is more to their liking. Well, the South took him up on that. The first state to go was South Carolina. Then followed all the southern states, the Gulf states, from Florida all the way across to Texas. In 1861, Tennessee voted to stay in the Union. We were upset about things, just not quite as upset as the other southern states were. In March of '61, I made my way quickly off to Washington City to attend Mr. Lincoln's inauguration. And I had a meeting with him while I was there. And at that time, I advised him in that meeting that I thought the best course of action to take was to simply let them go in peace. And I came back home to Tennessee believing that Mr. Lincoln had adopted a pacifistic policy in this matter, only to discover later on that all the while behind the scenes he had been conspiring to reinforce Fort Sumter. Well, South Carolina waited for 5 months, finally lost her patience and opened fire. Word got back to Tennessee about it, and we were upset about it, no doubt. But we believed that Lincoln had provoked the matter. We were still part of the United States at that point. But when word came from Abraham Lincoln that he expected Tennessee to provide troops to invade the Confederacy, that did it. I've never seen anything like it. Overnight, attitudes changed totally. Governor Harris sent word back. Mr. Lincoln was told in that note, Tennessee will not provide one single man for the purposes of coercion. So Tennessee seceded. And I believe we had every right to do so. I believe General Robert E. Lee perhaps said it best. A union held together by a bayonet holds no attraction for me. I thank you for your time and the visit. Have a pleasant evening.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you here. How is everyone doing?
Fine.
Great. It's great to have guests. I don't get many here that often. However, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Major William Clare, and I'd like to introduce you to my bride who will be here shortly. Her name is Miss Mary Hadley. But while I'm waiting for her to get here, I will tell you a little bit about myself and about how I met my Southern belle. Actually, I'm not from Tennessee. I'm from the state of Alabama, the city of Huntsville. Matter of fact, somebody in a group earlier said that there they have a space center. Now, I'm not sure which foolishness this person is talking about. However, he did assure me that it's still about a 100-mile journey back to my home city of Huntsville. As you all know, Alabama seceded from the Union before Tennessee did, and that's when I enlisted and joined up with the great Confederate Army. And while I was there, then Tennessee succeeded, and we had to join forces while we had a foothold, a line of men, and a foothold coming from the foothill of Missouri all the way up to the state of Virginia. And then when Tennessee succeeded, they needed help, so some of our forces from Alabama went up to the state of Tennessee, and I was part of that force. And I was stationed at Nashville, and it was there that I met my bride-to-be, Miss Mary Hadley. Now, let me tell you, there was another Confederate officer that loved her so, but she didn't love him in return, and that was good for me, but it's good that we don't bring that up when Miss Mary gets here.
Hello, dear.
Oh, hi, Mary.
Look at all the company we have this evening.
I know, it's good to have them out here today.
Yes.
Why don't you tell our friends here the story about the time that the Yankees stole your horse, Black Beauty?
Oh my. I never shall forget the day, and since the subject has been broached, I will share my story. My mother had given me a horse just before the war. Why, the very name of Black Beauty conjures up my high-bred dainty mare. Did you ever see a horse that could step in perfect time? Well, I'm sure that the Yankees were never quite as pleased with her as I had been. Let me tell you about where we had lived. I believe today it is known as 28th Avenue North, which at the time we called Hadley Avenue. I believe also that where our home once stood is now Hadley Park. This is, of course, where we lived. I was riding with Black Beauty that day out on the Charlotte Turnpike, and Yankees approached, demanding that I turn over my horse so that General Rousseau could send it to his daughter in Kentucky. Well, Black Beauty must have sensed my terror, and she carried us off at a rapid gallop back to our home, with the Yankees behind us in a mad pursuit, whooping the whole way there. My mother must have heard us approaching and ran out onto the piazza. Now, she offered them a fine pair of carriage horses, which they refused. She then offered them nearly $500 worth in gold. They also refused. Their vulgarities will not be mentioned here again today, though. The last I saw of my fine pet, she was cantering down the drive as they led her away.
You know, Mary, that is so typical of those Yankees. I remember when I was in General Hood's staff down in Atlanta, Georgia. The Yankees were shelling the town, and I recall one lady that was ironing and was killed by shrapnel. I recall young children, innocent children, that were killed in the presence of their parents. And I recall one child that was asleep and was killed by the shrapnel and the shelling that the Yankees were doing on that town. I remember many people that were homeless and hungry, in need of shelter and food. And they came to me for answers, and I couldn't do anything for them. The only thing that I could do was encourage them to go to the nearest city, to get far away from Atlanta, where that they might be able to find some charity there.
We do have one happier story to share with you all, though, right, Major Claire?
Yes.
During the battle that was about to take place, I had gone to stay with the Overtons, which I believe their property is now known as Travelers Rest. Major Claire had, of course, gone to my home, though. One of our good friends, though, from before the war, and a neighbor, General Cheatham, had come to Travelers Rest to find me. He saw me standing there on the porch and said that your bird has flown. He has braved the Yankee rifles and gone to your home. Well, I knew, of course, at the time there were 10,000 Yankees camped out on our land and he would surely be killed. So General Cheatham sent one of his orderlies ahead, and very shortly, at least within the nearest hour, we were reunited.
I quickly proposed, and she said yes.
Yes.
And you never know what lies in the future, and this was on the eve of a great battle, and I was about to leave to go to battle. But it was so much comfort to know that she would be there waiting for me should I return.
Yes. Now, during the battle itself, the Overtons and I hid in the cellar, and though our small army was swept away, it wasn't until after the war itself that Major Claire and I were reunited. I'm so glad that you all were able to come out and visit us here tonight. Such a pleasure to have you all here.
Thank you for coming.
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Thank you for coming. May I introduce myself? My name is Adelicia Hayes Franklin Eklund Cheatham. I was born in Nashville in March of 1817, the oldest daughter of Oliver Bliss and Sarah Hightower Hayes. May I introduce you to my second husband? This is Colonel Joseph Ackland.
Good evening. It's so nice to have visitors with us tonight, most of them at least. You'd be surprised how few that we do get around here, so we're glad you came. I was born in Huntsville, Alabama in June of 1816, the grandson of the town's founder. At age 19, I went to Texas. fighting the Texas Revolution to help them gain their independence from Mexico. Earned the rank of colonel. By profession, I was a lawyer.
I graduated from the Nashville Female Academy at the age of 16 and subsequently became engaged to a young man by the name of Alfonso Gibbs, but he would die before we could marry. 5 years later, I met and married a man almost twice my age. His name was Isaac Franklin of the Fairview Plantation in Gallatin. It was a happy marriage that produced 4 children, 3 little girls and a little boy who only lived for 13 hours. After 8 years of marriage, Isaac suddenly became ill in Louisiana, and he died there. Within weeks of their father's death, our 2 oldest daughters, Victoria and Adelicia, also became ill and died. I couldn't stay at Fairview, so I returned to Nashville. I bought a home on Cherry Street, which is now your 4th Avenue. At the same time, I also purchased a rather large parcel of land that I intended to use for further development. I did that with part of my inheritance, you see, because Isaac was an incredibly wealthy man, owning not only the Fairview plantation, but 3 plantations in Louisiana, as well as railroad interests, stocks and bonds, and various other investments. So I was left an incredibly wealthy widow. So ladies, after I met Mr. Joseph Acklin, I did not agree to marriage until the man signed the mother of all prenuptial agreements.
You know, I have been listening to how wealthy that Isaac was for the past 150 years. And frankly, my dear, I'm getting a little tired of it. No, I did not have much money. You must admit, Addie, I was a good manager and only increased our assets.
I will readily concede the point, and I will try not to mention Isaac's wealth for at least another 150 years.
We should mention, speaking of 150 years, we should mention that this is the 150th anniversary of our home, Belmont.
Shortly after our marriage, we began work on the estate that was intended to be our summer home. However, between 1859 and 1860, we renovated the house to make it a full-time residence. You see, we had every intention of spending our winters in Louisiana and our summers in Tennessee. But then we decided to make it a year-round residence and did that very simply by turning the back porch into what is now known as the Grand Salon.
We moved into Belmont in 1853. It was a huge estate with every modern amenity. The house is Italianate in design with just a few touches of New Orleans-style architecture. There were greenhouses where we grew flowers and tropical fruit. And we had a water tower that provided running water right into the house. And out on the grounds there were gazebos and marble fountains. And we had a deer park and a zoo with ornamental cages, as well as a bear house, and an artificial lake that was inhabited by alligators imported from Louisiana.
I love to make grand entrances, so I had a large staircase installed which descends into the Grand Salon. A portrait of Queen Victoria dominates the staircase landing to this day. I decorated the house in true Victorian style with richly patterned wallpapers and drapes with heavy fringe. We entertained often in Belmont, and I like to plan my parties to coincide with the full moon, so that as guests drove up the long approach, moonlight would illuminate the house and the grounds.
Well, in 1855, tragedy struck Belmont when our twin daughters, Laura and Corinne, died.
That same year, I lost my daughter, Emma Franklin.
More tragedy would come to Belmont and the South in 1861 with the onset of the war between the states. February of 1862 saw the fall of Fort Donelson. We heard the news in church that Sunday morning. As Yankee troops were marching toward Nashville, it was decided later that evening that I would leave that very night for Louisiana to oversee our plantations there. Adelicia would remain at Nashville at Belmont with our 4 remaining children. Sad for me to say I would never get to see them again on that side of life.
In 1863, like Isaac before him, Joseph also died on the plantations in Louisiana. I had no time for grief. the cotton crop on which our family was dependent was in jeopardy from both armies. I sailed to Louisiana and spent the better part of the next few months trying to rescue the cotton crop from both friend and foe. We were finally able to load it onto a gunboat that ran the Union naval blockade of New Orleans, and the cotton crop arrived in Liverpool, England, to the Rothschild family, who sold it then for $960,000. I came home from Louisiana the long way because it was considered the safer way. I came home by sea through New York. By the time I reached Nashville again and Belmont, I found Union troops camped on the grounds preparing for the Battle of Nashville, which was fought on December 16, 1864. Well, I packed up what furniture I could and my family and moved it all into the home of Mrs. James K. Polk in downtown Nashville, rightly thinking that Union troops would not dare enter the home of a former United States president. Now, after the war, I had to get to Europe. I had to go get my money. So I booked passage and sailed for Europe. In 1884, I left Belmont and moved with my three youngest children, to Washington, D.C., where my oldest son had been a United States Senator. In 1887, on a shopping trip to New York City, I became ill with pneumonia and died there. My body was returned to Nashville, and my funeral was held in the downtown Presbyterian Church, where I had been a lifelong member. If you're ever downtown and you hear the bells chime, I hope you'll think of me. I donated those bells to the church.
Well, today you can see our home on the campus of Belmont University. The gazebos are still out on the lawn, and the water tower overlooks the area as it has for the past 150 years. And Mark Brown and his staff, they've done a marvelous job of restoring our home. And you can tour it every day except for Sundays and Mondays. And for the anniversary, a lot of special events have been planned, and the public is invited. We'll be there, but you may not be able to see us. We want to thank each of you for coming to visit with us. We bid to each one of you a very good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen. Brigadier General James Edward Rains at your service. I'm glad to see so many of you here tonight. I wasn't sure that anybody would be able to find me, considering that this is not my original resting place. I was first buried in the city cemetery over near your Cumberland Museum. I'm not exactly sure why they moved me here, but I am sure that they didn't ask my opinion in the matter. And to confuse things even more, they left the original marker over there in place in the old cemetery. But as you can see, I'm here now. Like many of you, I am a Nashvilleian. I was born and raised in the city, only leaving to attend Yale School of Law, where I graduated in 1854 before my 21st birthday. But I didn't find the North much to my liking, and I quickly moved back here to Nashville to establish my law practice. In 1858, I was elected city attorney, and in 1860, I was elected attorney of the District of Davidson, Williamson, and Sumner counties. I was also the associate editor of the Nashville Republican Banner. My good friend and another future Confederate general, Felix Zollicoffer, was the editor. Now, I do wish you to know that we had no association whatsoever with that unwelcome party of Mr. Lincoln. We were Whigs, and as such, we supported the candidacy of Mr. John Bell, whom I believe y'all met earlier this evening. Well, as I understand it, the Whigs are no longer a political party. So you should know that we were strong believers in the U.S. Constitution and in the Union. And if John Bell had been elected president, I'd strongly believe there would have been no secession and no war. In fact, when secession was first proposed here in Tennessee, it was voted down by the populace. It was not until Abraham Lincoln called for troops to invade the South that sentiments changed overnight. It became quite clear to everyone that Lincoln and the North intended to bend the South to its will by force of arms. Now, this was something that I did not believe in at all. And though the Whigs had opposed secession at first very strongly, we all agreed now that we no longer wish to remain a part of the United States. Now, Felix and I were quite prepared to lay down our lives in defense of our beliefs and our homes. And that's exactly what Felix did, dying in battle in the mountains of eastern Kentucky in 1862. But I'm afraid I'm getting ahead of myself just a mite. At the time, my dear wife Ida made it clear to me in no uncertain terms that she much preferred that I stay home, or at the very least not lay down my life, but return in sound and safe. And I cannot say that I really blamed her much. We had not been married for all that long, and our daughter Laura was only barely 2 years old at the time. But she understood and she believed in my convictions, and though it wrenched her heart to do so, she agreed with me. And so in May of 1861, I enlisted as a private in the 11th Tennessee Volunteer Infantry Regiment. Now, I was quite prepared to serve as a private in the ranks, but when we elected officers that spring, I was deeply honored when the men elected me to command the regiment as their colonel. Now, not too many days after that, the people of Nashville presented us with a brand new battle flag. And on that occasion, I gave a speech from the balcony of the City Hotel, which stood on the square. I believe it's what used to be across from where your Nashville-Davidson County Courthouse now stands. And on that occasion, I was proud to have my wife Ida and Laura stand with me. And with your kind indulgence, I would like to read a small portion of the speech that I gave that day. On behalf of the gallant men before us, I accept these colors as a holy emblem of freedom and human rights. To you, brave men, I commit this banner. Defend it with your valor and your lives. Let it be the everlasting symbol of a patriotic and a holy cause. You may sleep the everlasting sleep of death upon some far-off plain, but your memories will be forever enshrined in the great heart of that country, upon whose altar and in defense of whose rights you shed your blood, as long as the blue mountains shall point to the heavens or our bright waters run down to the seas. We shall come back in glory or will not come again. Well, it was not long before the men of the 11th and I had ample opportunity to find glory, first with Felix, and then after his untimely death with General Braxton Bragg and the Army of Tennessee in their Kentucky campaign. During that arduous duty, the men of the 11th showered themselves with honor, and as a result of their valorous conduct, I was promoted and given command of a brigade in November of 1862. Now, Nashville at this time was an occupied city. So in December of that year, found our army encamped in front of Murfreesboro, where we hoped to draw the Yankees into a decisive battle that would not only free the city of Nashville, but drive their army clean out of Middle Tennessee. Well, finally, after a few false starts and fits, a few days after Christmas, General Rosecrans finally moved his Yankee army south to meet us. Now, it was General Rosecrans' plan to attack our right flank early on the morning of December 31st. By coincidence, it was General Braxton Bragg's plan to attack the Yankee right flank early on the morning of December 31st. Now, if both armies had moved at dawn as the generals had commanded, we might have danced around each other in a giant circle. But as it was, fate was with us and we attacked first. Now, you know, it is still a mystery to me to this day why the Yankees were not more prepared. They knew that we were encamped there, not hardly 100 yards to their front, and they were supposed to be prepared to go into battle that morning themselves. But when we hit them, they were calmly sitting there around their campfires cooking breakfast. Bacon and hardtack, I believe. Well, my brigade and I were on the far left flank of our lines. To my right was a brigade of Texans. Well, the first men that the Texans came across didn't even have their rifles loaded. Well, I managed to get my brigade in behind and to the side of the Yankees as the Texans hit them from the front. You have never seen so many terrified Yankees run so quickly in your life. By 7 o'clock, we had 1,000 Yankees in tow and were dragging 8 of their cannon behind us. The Texans, they even captured a general. Willich was his name, I believe. He was a communist of all things. I hear that he survived the war and went to Europe to study under Karl Marx himself. Well, it was this moment that I made a slight tactical error. There was a large body of Yankees moving to the west, and I took my brigade in pursuit. What I did not know was that General Joe Wheeler and the cavalry was already to the west, ready to round up any Yankees that moved in that direction. What I should have done was to move my brigade to the north, to the Nashville Pike. It was their only escape route back to Nashville. Well, I realized my mistake after a few moments and wheeled around to the north. And it was then that I learned that we had been victorious all up and down the line. We had 3,000 Yankee prisoners by then and 24 cannon captured. But at that time, the Yankees were reforming their lines along the Nashville Pike. For our army to be completely victorious that day, we need to smash that line before they could dig in. Well, when we came out of that cedar forest that was right to their front, a lot of my boys were sporting brand new blue overcoats that they had recently acquired in the federal camps. Well, those Yankees were mildly confused by this. They didn't know who we were. So they held their fire until we were right up on top of them. I'd never been so proud of my boys as we drove those Yankees once again towards what appeared to be a final stand in amongst what was left of their cannon. Well, I was in the front leading the charge when I felt a sudden blow to my chest. It knocked me plumb out of the saddle. When I glanced down, I saw that the whole front of my jacket was turning red with my own blood. I managed to shout out, "Forward, my brave boys, forward," before I collapsed. Well, the booming of those cannon, it sounded to me almost like applause, and I heard my own words, "We'll come back in glory or we'll not come again." Well, in the smoke, I even thought I could see Ida standing there with Laura in her arms. And I wanted to reach out to her. I wanted to fold her into my arms, but I found that I could not move. And the noise there just slowly faded away and everything grew quiet and calm. I'm afraid that's all that I can remember. I appreciate your kind attention this evening.
Thank you.
No.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am General William Hicks Jackson, and this is my wife, Celine Harding Jackson. We are buried immediately behind you. It is due to my wife's family, the Hardings, that we were so fortunate to live at the Belmead Plantation. Would you like to please tell us about how your family came to establish Belmead, Miss Jackson?
Certainly. My great-grandfather Giles Harding and my grandfather John Harding came from Virginia in 1798. There were just about 300 people in Nashville at the time. Most lived in log cabins or at Fort Nashboro. They built a home out along the Natchez Trace. You know it as the Devon farm out on your Highway 100. When my grandfather grew up, he moved in toward town. He bought a log cabin on the Richland Creek. The Trace, you know, crosses the creek about 100 yards upstream. He built a blacksmith shop there. When my father was 6, he saw soldiers marching south with Andrew Jackson. Sometime later, they came back by, having defeated the British at the Battle of New Orleans. My grandfather did a lot of farming at the time, so when my father grew up, the land was really becoming a plantation. My mother was Elizabeth McGavick. She grew up at Carnton, which still stands in Franklin. I love to hear how they got married. Their wedding day was bitter cold and there was snow on all the hills. My father made quite an impression by showing up in a sleigh drawn by a span of his finest horses.
Your father was a fine man. Her father and mine were old friends. That is how I came to know Lena, Celine's nickname. But I went off to school. I was accepted at West Point, and I was graduated there in 1856. The United States Army sent me off to New Mexico. There was a tribe there that were worse than the Apache, and even worse than the Comanche. It was the Kiowa tribe. Our job there was to protect the white settlers. Once when I was out on patrol there, one of the soldiers was in a fight, in a hand-to-hand combat with one of the savages, and I saved his life during that combat. It is strange to note that later he became a general in the United States Army, while I became a general in the Confederate Army.
You see, Tennessee was very reluctant to leave the United States. My father said that the U.S. Army would soon invade the new Confederate nation, and Tennessee would have to secede. I knew he was right, but I never really got over what they did to us. When Fort Donelson fell, the U.S. Navy came up the Cumberland River and Nashville soon surrendered. Their army followed and put us all under military rule. They even sent my father to prison in Michigan for giving money to our army. The soldiers terrorized us. Most souls had their homes burned. What happened to us may seem insignificant. Have you heard of the deer park we have? Well, they shot 60 or more deer and over a dozen of our magnificent buffalo. We never knew what to expect next. One morning, Mama and I heard a servant screaming. One of the Yankee soldiers was trying to have his way with her. Well, she boldly ran into our house, and as I tried to close the door, he tried to stab me with his bayonet. Mom hit the girl, and the soldier eventually cowered away. When our Confederates finally came to retake Nashville in 1864, we didn't realize how outnumbered we were. As the Confederate cavalry retreated across our front lawn, I ran out onto the porch, waving my handkerchief at them. The Yankees were still firing, and the bullets were hitting the stone columns on the porch. If you visit my home in Belmead, you'll still see those columns. General, why don't you tell about the war?
I thought you would never ask. You see, it was an exciting time for me. You know, at that point, I was in the cavalry. I was a general at 28 years old. But that wasn't uncommon. There were many of us. In fact, Thomas Benton Smith was at 26. And he's buried up there at Confederate Circle. I first served under General Earl Van Dorn and under General Forrest. The Yankees were making their first approach on Vicksburg. We raided behind their supply lines and destroyed their huge supply base. At the same time, General Forrest was tearing up the railroad tracks. And they had to retreat. Then after, I also served with Van Dorn and with Forrest at Thompson Station, just south of Franklin. We surrounded the enemy, and they were forced to surrender. During that battle, one of our color bearers had fallen. There was a young lady named Alice Thompson who saw the battle from her basement window. She saw the color bearer fall, and she ran upstairs and outside and grabbed the colors and rallied our troops to victory. It was funny that after the battle, General Forrest and General Van Dorn argued over who should get credit for the battle. General Forrest said he was so mad that he could take Van Dorn's heart, rip it out, throw it on the ground, and stomp on it. But he never got the chance. You see, there was a jealous husband who found that Van Dorn was calling on his wife in Spring Hill. And he shot Van Dorn dead.
Now, dear, let's not go into that.
Yes, of course. There are children present. But I see there are other guests coming to see us. But please do visit our home at the Belmead Plantation. Thank you and good night.
Lieutenant William Harvey Berryhill, at your service. I'm actually not buried here. I'm buried in an unmarked grave right over the hill in Confederate Circle. But I understand that your donations this evening will help to put my name, as well as many others, on a memorial. You have no idea what that means to us. Perhaps I can tell you a little bit about myself so that you may remember me. I was born the son of Samuel Berryhill and Margaret Ann Berryhill in Pickens County, which is about halfway between Tuscaloosa and Mississippi. Now, when I was young, my family had the opportunity to buy some fine farmland over in Mississippi. So when I was 10 years old, the uncles, aunts, all the family picked up and moved over to Mississippi. Now, our last name being Berryhill, naturally the settlement became known as Berryhill, Mississippi. I understand that you won't find Berryhill on the map today, but they've renamed it Bellefontaine. I suppose Berryhill is an unusual name for a place that's flat as a pancake. Now, when Mississippi exercised her right to secede from the Union, we hoped that it could be done peacefully. We understood that the North relied on that river trade to get her products to export, get her products down the Mississippi. Our own president, Jefferson Davis, from Mississippi, guaranteed the free, open trade of the Mississippi River. And he hoped to assure them that we could live as two separate nations in peace and continue to trade. But it was all to no avail, for President Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, as he called it. Well, I was 33 years old at the time and had 5 young children, with one on the way. My wife, Mary, begged me not to enlist. She convinced me that there were many younger, more able-bodied boys ready, willing, and able to fight in this short war that would surely be over in a few months. and there was no need for me to hurry off into it. But after a year, the war continued to drag on. The Yankees were at Shiloh Church, a little place just north over the Tennessee line. A great battle was fought there in early April 1862. The biggest battle of the war to that point. They called it Bloody Shiloh. The Confederate Army fell back to Corinth, Mississippi, and the Federals pursued slowly. Mary and I both realized that the war was drawing us into it, whether we wanted to or not. And after my uncles assured me that they would put out the spring crop for me, the decision was made. I enlisted in a company that was being formed near Berry Hill on a beautiful spring day in late April 1862, not long after the Battle of Shiloh. We marched north and joined up with the Confederate Army there at Corinth, and were mustered into the 43rd Mississippi Infantry. Corinth had terrible conditions, poor water, and a lot of disease. Did you know that 1,700 Confederate soldiers died in the Battle of Shiloh? But a far, far greater number than that died in the 7 weeks that we were camped at Corinth from disease such as dysentery. The Army evacuated Corinth and fell back to Tupelo, Mississippi, in hopes that the better water there would stop the disease problems. Being around so many new people, being around so many diseases which I had never been exposed to, I took ill myself. Being so close to home, they allowed me to go home and recuperate at Berry Hill. I rejoined the unit near Vicksburg later that fall. And the Yankee Army was campaigning hard to capture Vicksburg, Mississippi. Vicksburg, Mississippi was considered to be the Gibraltar of the Mississippi. But the Yankees knew that if they took Vicksburg, they had the Mississippi River. And if they had the Mississippi River, they cut the South in two and deprived us of all the supplies and troops of the western Mississippi states. Now, while I was gone, the 43rd had drafted a new recruit into service, Old Douglas. Old Douglas was 7 feet tall, had big yellow teeth, and weighed almost 1,000 pounds. If you had extra blankets to carry, or if you had extra rations to carry, Old Douglas would carry him on his back. Old Douglas was about as stupid as he was big, though. I shouldn't be too hard on Old Douglas. Well, you see, Old Douglas was the only camel in the state of Mississippi. That's right, I said camel. I'd say that deserves an explanation. Jefferson Davis, when he was elected to the U.S. Senate in 1848, proposed that the government purchase camels from Arabia to be used to transport military supplies across the southwest desert to California. Quite a fiasco, as I understand it. Anyhow, when the war broke out, the Texans managed to capture a great number of those camels and press them into Confederate service. I understand that Job had 6,000 camels. The Bible tells us so. My mother used to preach to me about having the patience of Job, and after knowing Old Douglas for a few months, I certainly understand how much patience Job must have had to have 6,000 camels. For Douglas was the orneriest animal I've ever had the displeasure of knowing. But Old Douglas was taken from us by a Yankee sniper bullet outside of Vicksburg. Vicksburg was a terrible place to be at that time. The Yankee gunboats shelled the city day and night. The Yankee Army had us encircled. There was very little food. Even the citizens of Vicksburg had to leave their homes for their own safety and dig caves in the side of the bluff along the Mississippi River and live like rats in holes. Now, our lines were never broken, although they were assaulted numerous times. But on the brink of starvation, General Pemberton finally had to surrender our force to General Grant. Now, we weren't sent to Yankee prison camps, mind you. We were paroled and exchanged for Yankee prisoners. Having been cut off and out of communication for all that time, I was concerned about what had become of my family. It was then that I finally received a very old letter from Mary, who told me how the Yankee cavalry had come to our house in Berry Hill. They had stolen our chickens, our livestock, our cattle, our pigs. They had gone into the house and broken all the dishes. They had used their swords to slash the mattresses open and the pillows, searching for valuables hidden there. They had dragged my 6 children out of the house and set the porch afire. When Mary realized what they were doing, setting a fire under the porch to burn our house down, she begged them to stop. She pleaded with them and asked them to please refrain from this, for the only thing that she had to give her children for Christmas was a roof over their heads. But they ignored her. They held her back, set the fire, and then the brave Yankee cavalry rode away. My brave Mary extinguished the fire by herself and saved our home. You can understand how, even though our situation by this time in the war seemed hopeless, we continued to fight on. Winter found us on the cold ground just outside of Nashville, besieging an army larger than our own. Now, the 43rd Mississippi was on the extreme left of the Confederate line at Redoubt 1. I'm told by a visitor this evening that if you go down Woodmont Boulevard towards Hillsborough Road, you'll find the remains of Redoubt 1 by a Unitarian church. When the Yankees finally came out of the city and commenced their assault on our lines, they outnumbered us on the left flank 8-1. The situation was hopeless. Our retreat turned into a rout as we made a run for the Granny White Pike, our only avenue of escape. It was at that point that a bullet struck me, and I fell face up on the cold ground. But it was an odd sensation, for I felt no pain, nor did I feel my legs or my arms. The bullet had shattered my back. And as I lay and stared helplessly up at the sky, feeling my life ease away from me, I could watch the lazy arc of the Federal artillery shells as they traversed the sky to fall towards the Confederate rear. And it reminded me of an Independence Day celebration I had taken my children to several years before the war, when we watched the rockets. And I explained to my children that they were to commemorate our American War of Independence fought by our forefathers. This war, in which I and so many others died, was indeed the second American War of Independence, one which we sadly lost. But the story of this poor southern farmer from Mississippi who's buried in the unmarked grave is actually the story of your own liberty. For liberty and independence is a gift passed down from your forefathers, paid for in blood, a gift that should be cherished and treasured and preserved and kindled. For if you ever ignore that gift, that flame of liberty, and allow it to be extinguished by the tyranny of oppressors, the gift is lost forever.
It's been in the news, and a lot of people have said they really don't understand what's going on with that building, and I wanted to make a few statements to let you know that that is a Civil War memorial in Tennessee. Now, that building was built in 1935 with about a third of the money coming from the UDC, United Daughters of the Confederacy. And it was intended to memorialize Tennesseans who fought and died in the war. And it's been there for about 70 years. If you've been reading the papers, you found out that the current administration at Vanderbilt kind of feels that that is not appropriate to have that name Confederate in the 21st century, and they want to remove it. But I did want you to understand, it is a war memorial. That was the intent when it was constructed. It's a lovely building if you ever get over on the Peabody campus. It's neat to look at, and I hope you won't be offended by it. But I think the general's coming in a minute. After he's done, I've got a few more comments I'd like to make.
Good evening. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Major General Benjamin Franklin Cheatham. Now, I'm not buried in this part of the cemetery. I'm actually closer to Lebanon Road on the other side of the Confederate Circle. I'm buried there with my wife and my family. As I was strolling over here tonight and I came through the Confederate Circle, I saw the place where my two daughters drew the veil for the dedication in 1889. I wish that I could have been there, but I had died 3 years before that, so I wasn't able. From what I understand, whenever I died, there were over 30,000 people that attended my funeral. There was a mile line just to get in the cemetery to come to the funeral that day. Now, I've said all this, and probably still a lot of you don't know who I am, so I'll give you a little background on myself. I was born in the Cockrell Bend area. That's on the Cumberland River, and I used to swim in the Cumberland River all the time. In fact, I swam there with a lot of the servants' children, and one of the children had almost drowned, and I was able to pull them to safety and save them. My family, they had land that went down in another bend that's now full of industry, and that's where the prison sits. Now, my mother's grandfather was James Robertson. He's the one who actually discovered Nashville. Excuse me, the dog's out here. After that, I'd served in the Mexican War, and I went on to serve in the war that won us our independence. As a general, I had troops that was known as the Army of Tennessee, and one of our battles was on the other side of the Mississippi in the Boot Hills of Missouri. I had happened across infantry of men, and I just walked up to them and was talking with them and asked them, I said, who they were with, and they said Illinois. So I asked them if they could stay there for a minute, and I just left, went over, got my group of men, and commanded them to come back and attack, and we took them all out. Now, Grant, of course, lost all these men, and Grant and I had been friends for quite some time. We were friends in Mexico when we were both in the Mexican War, and we managed to remain friends throughout. We both had a zest for life. We enjoyed our drinking and our betting on horses. In fact, I was the proprietor of the Nashville racetrack, which is now where Metro Center sits. Grant asked me if I would go out on his boat after we got back to Tennessee, and we went out one day and we were just having some drinks and talking, and I just asked him, I said, maybe we could just settle this war over a bet. And it would have been nice if we could have done that, but as you know, that would have been way too easy. And a lot of innocent people lost their lives. I was one of the few who didn't, and I'm thankful for that. I appreciate all of you coming by this evening, and I believe this gentleman is going to tell you where you'll be going from here. Thank you.
You got 3 more stops on the tour. The next one is going to be Fanny Battle up the hill. Then there's a gentleman named D.C. Kelly, who was a Confederate officer and one of the founders of Vanderbilt University. And finally, David Lipson. So these were people who were influential in Nashville in the 1870s and the period after the war. I hope you have a good night, and the good part of the tour is just starting to get dark. It's spooky after dark. See y'all later, and have a nice night.
My name is Fanny Battle. I'm 44 years old. Today was to have been my wedding day, but it was not to be. My fiancé was killed today in a bizarre railroad accident. I don't know all the particulars. All I know is that they're taking the flowers from the church and they'll lay them on the grave, and they'll pack away the bridesmaids' dresses for another happier time. They say I'll get through it, that I'll get by. I know I will. We all do in the face of tragedy. But you know, it must be the times that we're living in. It seems that I've seen my share of heartache. Well, I can remember when I was about 20 years old. There were, 17,000 people here in Nashville then. We had just built our beautiful Capitol set high up on the hill, and we were so proud. But then came the war, and then the Yankees. We called them the Federals. We Nashville girls got to know the enemy boys, actually, and some of them were pretty nice. We talked to them, but most of all, we listened. We heard them talk about all their battle plans, and they bragged about their successes. You know how men are. Well, we took this information back to our boys, and we're trying to do what we could for the war effort so they could fight the dreaded enemy. Well, somehow all the girls got away with it, all except me. One night they came for me. They found battle plans in my petticoats. And before I knew it, I was in a musty old cell at the old Tennessee State Penitentiary on Church Street. And you know, it's funny, my own daddy ran that penitentiary years after the war. Well, sooner or later, they took me up to the Yankee Capitol up in Washington, D.C. And that's where I heard that Abraham Lincoln had been shot. Soon afterwards, they let me out. So I came back to Nashville. My family was destitute. My 2 brothers had been killed at the Battle of Shiloh, and they'd imprisoned my daddy because he wouldn't leave the battlefield until he found the bodies of his boys. And my city, my beautiful Nashville, it was in ruins. It needed everything from schools to health care to hope. As for me, I got a job at the old Howard School teaching. I taught arithmetic and geography and spelling. I was making $55 a month, which was pretty good back in 1870. But you know, conditions in Nashville were still pretty bad. It was only 5 years after the war, and we needed so much. As a matter of fact, Mother Nature seemed to be against us too, because the banks of the Cumberland River overflowed and hurt the people that really needed help the most. So I said to myself, I'm going to do something about this. I got together with the civic leaders in our community and we formed a relief society. As a matter of fact, there were 1,100 people on the steps of the state capitol one time asking for food, shelter, and clothing. Well, United Charities was born, and when I wasn't teaching, I was helping. And have I told you about the ice wagon incident? I was driving my buggy through North Nashville one day, and I saw a little boy, only 4 years old, and he'd been run over by an ice wagon, and he was dead. No one seemed to know who he was. No one seemed to care. But I did. I decided to form what we call now a daycare center for children with nowhere to go. We brought the children in, we fed them, we clothed them, and we loved them. I even started a camp called the Fresh Air Camp in Kingston Springs. And as a matter of fact, we would go there to get away from the foul air of the city. I spent a lot of time there in my latter years. But the thing you will remember most about me is this Christmas, when you look out your front window and see the folks standing on your front door, and you will hear them singing Christmas carols and holiday songs. It's an idea I had back in 1917. And then, as now, all the money goes to Fanny Battle Daycare Center. It's all for the children. You know, the newspapers then even called me the Angel of the Poor. Well, this is getting to the end of my story. I'll tell you how it happened. I was with the children. We were going to the camp. We were at Union Station waiting for the train. The pavement was slick. I slipped and fell. 4 weeks later, I was dead on my 82nd birthday. And over there is where I lie. But don't be sad for me. I had a good life. I fought the Yankees. I fought hunger and poverty and loneliness. I fought to make this city we call Nashville the wonderful place it is. So this Christmas, when you hear the carolers outside your door, sing along, share the joy, show the world how wonderful we Nashvillians are. Thank you, and God bless you all. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
I'm Captain John Morton.
Who?
Captain John Morton.
I'm sorry, we couldn't hear you.
I was the commander of artillery. General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Some of you may have heard of that gentleman throughout much of the recent unpleasantness. Well, the war between the states. Many of you know that I am buried not too far from here, near the grave of John Bell, who ran a very strong fourth against Abraham Lincoln in 1860. Standing on this site, I can look west, and I can hardly see buildings that I remember from the years before the Civil War. Buildings such as our state capitol, you can't see it anymore. Buildings such as St. Mary's, beautiful church. Or the Western Military Institute, where I, as a lad, attended classes. The buildings were designed by Colonel Adolphus Hyman, a Dutchman, who is buried in this cemetery not too far from here at Confederate Circle. He immigrated from East Prussia sometime in the early 1830s with his brother, working as stonemason, later as an architect. Very gifted, very talented gentleman. Much of his work still visible today, the Western Military Institute, which stands on 2nd Avenue. It is used by an outfit calling itself the Metro Planning Commission. Whatever that is.
Yeah, really.
Colonel Hyman, along with his command, the 10th Tennessee Infantry, were captured at Fort Donelson on February the 16th, 1862. Most of the men in his command were Irish. I always thought it interesting. A Dutchman commanding a regiment full of Irishmen for the South. I was there that fateful night. That night, late December, that night, late February the 15th, 1862, when the word got out that the command at that place was to be surrendered, I wandered into the camp. I was serving in an adjunct capacity at that time as a junior officer, came into Forest Camp. I had heard a rumor that the Army was going to be surrendered. That rumor was confirmed when I heard then Lieutenant Colonel Forrest speaking to his troops. He looked at his men and he said, "The clothes you have on your back on this cold winter night, the weapons you've been firing, the horses you've been riding on, I paid for them all, and I will be..." Well, I will not repeat the language he used, but he was very determined that neither his men or his equipment would fall into the hands of U.S. Grant or Abe Lincoln or any of those fellas. And so he said, "Men, take all you can carry. Pack your haversacks. Put your blanket around you. Saddle up your horse. We're getting out of here." That's what they did. I rode out with them. And as I remember, that night, one of those with us was the parson, Mr. Kelly. He later became a colonel. He just happens to stay around here a lot. He's with us tonight.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I am Reverend David Campbell Kelly. And as the captain introduced me, I was a colonel during the war. I did not serve as a chaplain. I was with Forrest at Fort Donelson. And when the Yankee gunboats sailed up the Cumberland River and began to shell the fort, it was the first time he or any of us had experienced an artillery bombardment. We were all scared. Forrest was so scared that he screamed at me, "Parson, for God's sakes, pray, for only the Almighty can save us in this fort." Fortunately, our heavy artillery high up on the bluff was able with their plunging fire to drive off those gunboats. But then the Yankees brought up their army and surrounded the fort. When Forrest heard that the generals were planning to surrender the fort, he told them, "I didn't come here to surrender." And as Captain Morton said, we mounted up that night and rode out of there. I served with Forrest throughout the remainder of the war. And as I recall, Captain Morton, you came later that year to command his artillery.
I'm glad you asked, Colonel Kelly. I came to formally be under the command of General Forrest in late 1862, late that year, December. I was sent by a general whose name I've been trying to forget. What was it now? Oh yes,
Bragg.
It's still there. Bragg. Down to Columbia. And there, General Forrest, now General, looked at my paperwork and he said, "What can you do, Captain Morton?" I said, "I can command artillery, for I have read the book." He said, "Is that a fact?" And I said, "Indeed it is, sir." He said, "You seem mighty confident." I said, "I do what I can, sir." He said, "You can command my artillery." I said, "Thank you very much, sir. Where is it?" He said, "I don't have any artillery. But you will command it as soon as I get some." True to his word, a few days later, when we assaulted the federal garrison at Lexington, we came into the possession of 2 fine rifled cannon, limbers and caissons, and a few horses. Carried those guns throughout the war, putting them to good effect on many occasions. Many of you perhaps think that the turning point of the war was in 1863. I beg to differ. Came much later. General Forrest's greatest victory was at Bryce's Crossroads in northern Mississippi in June of 1864. Perhaps you remember his great victory there. I remember it well. On that occasion, you see, General Forrest moved upon the enemy undetected. You see, Nathan Bedford Forrest had no formal military training. We all knew that. But we had complete confidence in him, for he had some sort of sixth sense, an innate ability that cannot be measured. It really cannot be taught. He seemed to know what the enemy was up to. He seemed to know the enemy's strengths, the enemy's weaknesses. And he knew how to apply force at just the right time and in just the proper manner. On that particular day at Bryce's Crossroads, he rode up. I saluted. He said, "Captain Morton." He pointed to a position about a quarter of a mile away. He said, "Captain Morton, take your guns to that position. And there, at about 300 yards, it looks to me, you will assault the enemy." I stammered something. "Sir, you don't assault the enemy with artillery. You assault with infantry. You assault sometimes with cavalry, but with artillery." I began to, almost said something, but it wouldn't have done any good if you saw the look on that man's face. You don't argue with General Forrest. So, with a great fear, I was as scared as I ever was, because I'll tell you, I hate getting my guns that close to the enemy. But we did it, and we unloaded at 300 yards, unlimbered, turned them around, and I gave the orders to unload on the enemy with case shot and canister. I tell you, it was to telling effect. The enemy broke. They began to run. Our men began to hit them from three sides, even though, I'm told, the enemy outnumbered us 2-1. We got the best of them. We were chasing them for 50 miles. We captured 15 cannon. We took 1,500 prisoners. And best of all, we captured 157 wagons. I counted them all. I wrote it in my report. I had to go through each wagon, and I was forced, against my will, to confiscate several cases of whiskey and some of the finest cigars that you'd ever put in your mouth. After the battle, General Forrest came to me and he said, "Captain Morton, you should be a major, but I can't promote you now. It wouldn't be fair to the others. It would be showing favoritism. I do not believe that we could have won that battle without your gallant conduct on the field." He said this in front of his entire staff. I'm sure you remember that very well, don't you, Colonel Kelly?
Well, I remember something like that. But, seems I recall a little surprise attack we made later in November of that year at the Yankee base at Johnsonville, just west of here. We were able to sneak our guns up on the west side of the Tennessee River, and they had no notion we were anywhere around. When we opened up that day, we sank 4 gunboats, 14 transports, and 20 barges before the day was over. Later in December, we came here with the Army of Tennessee for the Battle of Nashville, and I had my artillery here just off Charlotte Pike at Davidson Steamboat Landing in Bell's Bend. From there, we were successful in driving off the Yankee Navy. Unfortunately, our army lost the battle and we were forced to retreat from Nashville. I understand that the earthworks that we used that day are still visible off Charlotte Pike, and the city of Nashville plans to open a park there. Before you folks leave here tonight, I must tell you that I was a Methodist preacher. Before the war, I had been a missionary to China. And the Chinese knew something about God and the 10 Commandments, but nothing of salvation. So I was proud of the work that I did there. After the war, I came back here to Nashville and served several congregations, one of which was McKendree, which is still very active down on Church Street today. I was also instrumental in the founding of Central University, a name that may not be familiar to most of you. However, after Cornelius Vanderbilt donated some $500,000, we changed the name of the school to honor him. Unfortunately, though, it saddens me to hear today that there are some there who would change the name of the Confederate Memorial Hall. I hope as you folks leave here tonight that your memories will be fairer. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies, gentlemen. I'm Brother David Lipscomb. Perhaps you've never heard of me, but you surely know the university named for me. Behind me is the Lipscomb family plot where you see the candle lit. My wife and I are buried in the far corner. Back in 1891, Brother James Harding and I started the Nashville Bible College. My wife Margaret and I had a farm on Granny White Pike, and in 1903 we gave 60 acres so the college could move out from town. That was 100 years ago. Do you know what else happened 100 years ago? We heard about the first airplane flight over on the coast of North Carolina. I've been standing here tonight watching these gigantic modern airplanes taking off. I hear that they are taking off from where Brother Tolbert Fanning's farm used to be. Have you heard of Franklin College? You probably haven't, as that is where your airport is also. Brother Fanning started that college to teach farming principles to young men to take back to their own farms. But we also studied the Bible. I wanted to obey God and had Brother Fanning baptize me. Eventually, we started the next idea of college, trying to learn, apply more biblical classes to the college, but of course at that time I was simply a student. After that, he eventually expanded the college. I would like to give you my view of the war. First, let me say that I voted for John Bell in the 1860 presidential election. I believe if Bell had won, there would have been no war. The U.S. would have followed its constitution. Even if some states seceded, they would have been allowed to do so in peace. I understand the Bill of Rights, specifically the 10th Amendment, gives states that right. Brother Fanning of Franklin College, he blamed Lincoln for invading and causing the war. If I may quote Brother Fanning, he stated, "It is honorable religiously even to rebel against oppression, as we conscientiously believe it is, that the southern states rebel against the assumed authority of the states north." With all due respect for Brother Fanning, I opposed all war. In my mind, political problems could not be solved by war. When churches divide, family members fight, our land desolated by an invading army, the very soil drinking the life's blood of our friends and brethren, I would not involve myself in this. Most Nashvillians never imagined the city would be occupied by the U.S. Army, but that is just what happened when Fort Donelson surrendered in February 1862. The following year, Lincoln issued a proclamation that a day of Thanksgiving be observed on the 26th of October. And the U.S. Army here required that its observance be met. Some of the brothers and sisters of the congregation down at Franklin refused to comply with this order. So when they gathered for services the following Sunday, You can imagine their anger when they found the church padlocked, with a note attached to the door. I have saved this note. Order of U.S. Army. The people meeting in this house, having seen fit to ignore President Lincoln's proclamation to meet and hold Thanksgiving services, are forbidden to hold further religious services within the lines of this military post during the occupancy of this place. Well, I went with Brother O.T. Craig to speak with the commander. Many feared we would be imprisoned, and your schools may not tell you that ministers here in Nashville were put in prison for not supporting the U.S. Army. But we explained to them that only God could appoint days of worship and not man. And so surprisingly, they allowed us to reopen the church. The war brought more hardship to our home. Our only child died at 9 months old. We lived across the river at Bell's Bend, and because of the war, we could not get a doctor out there, so my son died. I had hoped to raise him up to work for the Lord. So his death meant I had to work all the harder myself. Well, there was one great battle left to fight in Tennessee. As you know, it was here in Nashville. I believe you have just come from the grave of Colonel D.C. Kelly. He probably told you how the U.S. Navy came down to Bell's Bend, shelled his cavalry. We heard the roar of the artillery, but it did us no harm. We were tucked away in our log cabin. I have since heard that in 1985, some of the ladies with Lipscomb had the cabin moved to the university campus. After the war, I continued to farm. Brother Fanning and I had begun a publication called The Advocate just prior to the war. The South was so impoverished, we believed a spiritual uplifting was due, so we resumed publication and urged readers to support the poor, the sick, and the starving. Eventually, as I said, we moved the college to the dairy farm on Granny White Pike, but we didn't have any money to begin the college until 1891. I hear that there are 2,500 students there. We just began with 9 students. I continued teaching there until the age of 82. And 4 years later, I passed from this life at the age of 86 in 1917. The following year, they renamed the college after myself. Perhaps sometimes if you're out that way, you'll remember me. I have enjoyed your visit. Hope you've enjoyed your tour. We hope you'll come back again next year. Good night.
Come all you valiant soldiers, a story I will tell about the bloody battle that was fought on Shiloh's hill. It was an awful struggle that would cause your blood to chill. All from the bloody battle that was fought on Shiloh's hill. It was on the 6th of April, about the break of day. The drums and fife were playing for us to march away. My feelings at that moment I do remember still. When first my feet were tromping on the top of Shiloh's hill, and about the hour of sunrise the battle first began. And before the day was ended, we fought them hand to hand. The horrors of that battle did my soul with anguish fill. The wounded men